My name is Anna. I'm 28 years old. The house I'm standing in front of isn't a grand mansion or some luxurious estate. It's the place where my father once planted an apple tree in the front yard, where he tucked me into bed every night, and where he left me, in his handwritten will, with one final line. For Anna, my only daughter. But today, when I returned after 15 years, carrying legal documents and a heart heavy with emotion, my mother stood blocking the doorway, pointing straight at me, her voice cold. This is no longer your house. This is my family's house. Behind her was Richard, my new stepfather, and his two children, standing as if defending their territory. They looked at me like I was a trespasser, no greeting, no trace of recognition. I was denied entry into the very home my father had left me. In the end, I had to call the police, while neighbors gathered to watch as if it were some drama playing out in real life. Have you ever been treated like an outsider by your own family? Have you ever returned to a place you once called home only to realize you no longer belonged there? If you've ever felt that way, leave a comment below. Hit like if you believe justice deserves to be reclaimed, and don't forget to subscribe to hear the next part of my story. I'll tell you what happened after the police arrived and why my return wasn't just about reclaiming a house, but about reclaiming a stolen childhood. I was born and raised in the quiet suburbs north of Seattle. It wasn't glamorous, but my early years were full of warmth and laughter. My father, Marcus, was an architect. He had a habit I'll never forget. Every morning before work, he would crouch down to tie my shoelaces, even though I had long been able to do it myself, and say in his deep voice, "You're my only masterpiece." My mother, Lorraine, worked at a law office, always busy, always polished, sharp to the point of coldness. She rarely came home before 8 p.m., rarely smiled, and even more rarely hugged me. But with my father around, that emptiness never weighed on me. The old gray-roofed house, tucked behind rows of aging apple trees, was my whole world. It was where my father pinned blueprints to the walls of his study, where I learned to make hot cocoa, where he taught me to measure drawings with the worn wooden ruler he treated like a treasure. We'd spend evenings stretched out on the living room floor, watching his favorite black and white films. He used to tell me that every house is a story. A place has a soul if it's built with love. Everything shattered one October afternoon when I was 9. My father's pickup was struck broadside at an intersection a few blocks from home. The accident happened in an instant. People said he couldn't swerve in time, that it was the other driver's fault. But for me, none of that mattered. At the funeral, I stood silently beside the closed casket, clutching the worn teddy bear he had given me for my 6th birthday. I heard the adults whisper, heard my mother crying, heard the pastor praying, but my mind was blank. The house felt twice as big without my father in it. After the funeral, a lawyer came to the house. He presented a will my father had written just weeks before his death. I remember clearly my mother's face when he read the part about the inheritance. The entire house was left to me, along with a small savings account to be used only when I became an adult. My father had written plainly, "This house belongs to Anna. No one may sell, transfer, or claim this property until she turns 25. The lawyer finished reading in heavy silence. I didn't fully grasp what it meant, but I'll never forget my mother's expression. No tears. Just resentment in her eyes as she stared at the paper like she wanted to tear it to shreds. 3 months later, I came home from a piano lesson and found my mother sitting close to a strange man in the living room. Her eyes sparkled in a way I had never seen. She had never smiled at my father like that. His name was Richard, nearly 10 years older than her, in real estate. She introduced him as a close friend. I nodded, but something inside me turned cold. From then on, Richard appeared almost every week. I tried to disappear whenever I heard his car pull up, but I couldn't ignore the changes. My mother began wearing perfume each evening, the meals grew elaborate, and my father's study slowly became a storage room for odd new decorations. One night, I overheard her on the phone with him. Just wait a little longer, it'll all be settled. About 7 months after my father's death, my mother held a wedding in a small church by the lake. Everything was beautiful to the point that I felt detached from reality. I wore a pale white dress, held flowers, but there was no father to walk me down the aisle. No one asked if I was all right. Richard moved in with his 2 children. Megan, a year older than me, with blue eyes and a constant smirk. Tyler, younger by a few years, who often stole my toys and broke them. I once heard my mother say, "Try to get along. One day this house will belong to all of you." I asked her, "But the house is mine, didn't you forget?" She frowned, then gave a slight smile. "You're too childish. Papers don't mean anything if you don't live respectfully with adults." I didn't respond, but I understood. My mother stopped calling me sweetheart, baby, or even Anna. She called me the girl. My bedroom became a shared room. My desk was shoved into the kitchen corner. The belongings my father left me slowly vanished. She said, "No need to hold on to old things. You need to learn to grow up." I remember passing through the living room once and seeing Richard holding my father's wooden ruler. He chuckled and said, "Outdated junk." I said nothing, just walked away. Fists clenched until my knuckles turned white. I started spending weekends at my grandparents' house. I'd sneak there, using homework or the cat as an excuse. My mother didn't stop me. One day, she told me outright, "If you don't feel comfortable here, you can live with your grandparents. It'll be less work for me." That same afternoon, I packed my backpack and left with my grandfather without looking back. My mother didn't ask where I was going, didn't call after me. From the age of 12, I lived with my grandparents, carrying only a small box with my father's photo, an old diary, and a slip of paper he had once written for me. "That house will always wait for you to come home." I believed that until the day I stood at the front door, blocked by my own mother, realizing something more bitter than loss itself. People can strip a child of both home and memory if they no longer see that child as useful. I remember clearly that afternoon when my mother called me into the living room while Richard sat reading the paper. Megan and Tyler blasted music upstairs as usual. My mother sat on the couch, hands clasped, eyes staring past me out the window. "Anna, I've thought a lot," she began, voice softened but still edged with steel. "Your grandparents are getting old. You're grown now, you need to learn to care for others, not be a burden here." I stood still. Each word felt like a blade. "You'll move in with your grandparents next week," she continued. "We'll pack your things over the weekend." I looked at Richard. He said nothing, just flicked a glance at me, then turned another page as if I didn't exist. "Why me? Why not Megan or Tyler?" I asked. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, as if keeping her irritation in check. "Because you're the responsible one. You've always been close to your grandparents. They'll be happy to have you there." "Or is it because you need my room for Megan?" I said. Slowly. "I saw her moving my things in days ago." Her face darkened. "Don't be disrespectful, Anna. This is an adult decision. You have no say." I nodded, silent. I had already learned that once my mother made a decision, nothing, not even her own daughter, could change it. That night, I packed my belongings piece by piece. The old storybooks my father bought at a second-hand shop, the faded blue alarm clock, the small wooden box of letters he had written me. I placed everything into a cardboard box labeled Anna, Old Room. No one helped. No one said goodbye when I left. The day I moved into my grandparents' house, my mother said only one sentence: "Behave yourself, don't trouble them." Then she closed the door. No hug, no kiss, no farewell. My grandfather placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll be fine. This house always has room for you." My grandmother made me a cup of hot cocoa and set it beside the bed they'd placed by the attic window. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the maple leaves turning red, my heart as empty as the room without a child's laughter. From that day, I learned to live in silence. I learned to tell the difference between real affection and words spoken only out of obligation. My grandparents lived simply. They weren't wealthy, but they had something my mother never did: patience and kindness. Every evening, my grandmother cooked dinner and asked, "Anything fun at school today?" My grandfather would fold his newspaper whenever I walked over and ask, "Want to sit with me?" Just small gestures, but they made me feel warmth I had missed for years. Of course, I still thought of my mother. Whenever the school held parent meetings, I wished she would come. She never did. At the classroom door, it was always my grandfather in his pressed shirt, notebook in hand. When teachers asked about my mother, he smiled and said she was busy. I pretended not to hear. She showed up once when I finished middle school. She brought gifts, clothes, chocolate, and stayed less than 20 minutes, talking about Richard's new office, Tyler's baseball, Megan's summer program. I just nodded. Before leaving, she touched my hair and said, "I love you. You're still my daughter, remember?" I looked at her. The words felt foreign, almost hollow. I smiled back. I remember. She left, and through all of high school, she never came back. I grew used to birthdays with only my grandparents, no calls from the old house, no presents from my mother. But my grandparents always baked a cake, always wrote a card by hand, always hugged me tight at the end of the night. One Christmas Eve, I tried calling my mother. The phone rang for a long time before someone answered. Megan, her voice groggy, annoyed. "Why are you calling? What do you want?" I asked for my mother. She snapped, "She's busy," then hung up. I sat on my grandparents' sofa, looking at the small Christmas tree. Beneath it were a few carefully wrapped gifts. One from Grandpa, one from Grandma, and one small package I had bought myself. I didn't cry. I just felt a quiet emptiness that nothing could fill. The only thing left between me and my father was that house. Even while living with my grandparents, I remembered every brick, every beam where he hung Christmas lights. I remembered the smell of pine each winter. I never stopped thinking of going back, not to claim it, but to find the piece of myself that had been cut away. And more than anything, I believed that house was still waiting for me, just as my father had promised when he was alive. I never thought I'd stay in New York as long as I did. At first, it was just a place to run. After leaving Seattle, I studied marketing at a small college on the East Coast, far from everything that had once made me feel unwelcome. It was my grandparents who encouraged me. They didn't fully understand the career path I'd chosen, but they always said, "Just do your best. The rest is in God's hands." All through my 4 years of college, I studied as if every single exam were a bridge, leading me away from the haunting memories of my childhood. On nights when I stayed up writing reports or cramming for finals, I always kept a small photograph by my side, one my father had taken when I was 8, of the two of us standing in front of the old red brick house. I graduated with honors. No one from my mother's side came to the ceremony, but my grandparents flew across the country just to sit in the third row and clap loudly when my name was called. I still remember the pride in my grandfather's eyes when he handed me a bouquet wrapped in pages from the local Seattle newspaper, his small way of bringing home to me on that special day. After graduation, I was fortunate to land a job at a major media firm in Midtown. Back then, I rented a tiny studio apartment, just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. But I never once felt deprived, because I had something many people didn't. I lived on my own terms. No one imposed themselves on me. No one overshadowed me. I spent 6 years building my career. Each project I completed was like another brick laid in constructing the image of the woman my father had always believed I would become. I was promoted to team leader, managed my own client accounts, and slowly carved out a name for myself in the industry. But the higher I climbed, the more I realized one thing: no achievement could fill the emptiness inside me. Sometimes I would find myself staring into the tall mirror in my office, seeing the image of a polished, confident woman, but in the depths of my eyes was still that 12-year-old girl, packing her storybooks into a cardboard box with no one asking why. One May afternoon, after a client meeting that dragged on for more than 3 hours, I left the office and stopped at a secondhand bookstore I used to visit every Saturday. I picked up a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn with age, and it instantly brought back the memory of my father's walnut desk in his study. That evening at home, I opened my laptop and searched through an old folder my grandfather had once emailed me, a scanned copy of my father's will. My name was written clearly as the owner of the house. I remembered my grandfather's words: "When you're ready to face everything, go back." And I realized it was time to return. I turned in my resignation 3 months later. The company wasn't happy, but they respected my decision. I sold most of my belongings, keeping only my personal computer, a few favorite books, and the reading lamp my father had once given me. I booked a flight to Seattle with the intention of starting over. Not with grand illusions, but with clarity. I would open a small agency focused on communications for local businesses. I didn't want to chase multi-million-dollar contracts. I wanted to do something close to the community, the way my grandfather had always taught me. The real value lies in helping others grow. I needed capital. The clearest choice was my father's house. I had no intention of selling it. No matter what, it was the only spiritual legacy left to me. But if I rented it out, the deposit alone would cover the costs of leasing office space, hiring my first associate, building a website, and running for the first 3 months without having to take out a loan. I had calculated everything carefully. But what I didn't expect was that the house was not ready to welcome me back. 3 days after returning to Seattle, I went to City Hall to check the tax status and ownership records. Everything was still in my name. No one had any right to transfer, mortgage, or repurpose the house in any way. Then I went straight to the house on Maple Lane. My heart pounded as the taxi stopped in front of the wooden fence, its base rotting away. The roof was the same. The red bricks were still dark and weathered as I remembered, but there was now a plastic flower trellis draped across the porch and a new sign hanging loosely: "The Simmons family, together forever." I walked to the gate. Before I could ring the bell, the door opened. My mother stood there. She wasn't surprised. Her eyes were icy. She looked me up and down, then said in a voice thin as wind against glass, "What are you doing here?" I stood tall. "I came to see the house." "My house?" "No," she answered without flinching. "This is my house, my family's house." I stepped closer. "This is the property my father left me. Did you forget that?" Behind her, Richard came out holding a coffee mug. Megan sat on the sofa, her pregnant belly obvious beneath her cotton shirt. Tyler was glued to the television, not even turning his head. My mother still blocked the doorway, unmoving. "We've lived here nearly 16 years. You can't just walk in and take it all back." I gave a small smile. "I'm not taking it. The law already recognizes it. I have the paperwork." "Paperwork can't replace a home," she replied, her voice steady, low. I said nothing. I only looked at her, then passed her into the house. And I knew I couldn't do anything without being fully prepared. I turned away without a word, but I knew what I had to do. And I would not let anyone keep the one thing my father had preserved for me through all the ruins. I didn't go straight back to my grandparents' house that day. Instead, I drove aimlessly through old streets, past the bookstore where my father used to take me on weekends, past the lakeside ice cream shop where I once sat with my grandparents under the shade of maples. I needed time to breathe, because even though I had braced myself for confrontation, I hadn't expected the way my mother looked at me to make me feel like such a stranger. No hesitation, no flicker of doubt as she declared I had no right to the house my father had left me. Her words kept echoing in my mind like scissors cutting through childhood memories. I raised you. You owe me your whole life. I had thought I could return quietly, settle everything with paperwork. I had hoped we might sit down and talk as adults. But the way she looked at me, as if my presence only disrupted the peaceful life she had built with her new family, made it clear. I was no longer considered part of anything there. When I returned to my grandparents' house, my grandfather was watering the chrysanthemums in the garden, and my grandmother was preparing apple pie. They both looked at me with eyes so gentle it felt like they already knew what awaited me outside. "I saw Mom," I said softly, setting my bag on the familiar wicker chair. My grandmother set down the tray of pastries, wiped her hands on her apron, and asked gently, "What did she say?" I met her gaze. That it's her house. Her family's house. My grandfather was silent. Only the sound of water dripping from the hose and the ticking of the old kitchen clock filled the air. "Did you show her the will?" my grandmother asked. "Of course. But she said she'll sue. She said I owe her for raising me." My grandmother didn't react, just squeezed my hand. My grandfather put down the watering can, leaned on his knee, and sighed. "You don't owe anyone anything, Anna," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You spent your childhood here, not because someone paid to raise you, but because your heart was wounded. No one has the right to bind you with false debts." I stayed in the garden a long time, listening to the wind in the trees. What I felt then wasn't just anger or disappointment. It was clarity. I looked up the house records online. My name was listed as the sole owner, from the original deed to every tax renewal. The house had no liens, no legal disputes. I also reviewed the property taxes. And just as I suspected all these years, none of them had paid a dime. Every bill had been covered by my grandparents, even back when I was still in school. I turned to my grandfather. "Why didn't you ever tell me you two were paying the taxes on the house?" He smiled kindly and shrugged. "We couldn't let Marcus's house be seized by the government. After all, it was built with his heart." I said nothing more. My throat tightened, my chest filled with emotions I couldn't name, part gratitude, part regret, and the rest, determination. The next morning I met with a lawyer. Mrs. Davidson was in her 60s, with more than 30 years of civil law experience. She greeted me with a firm handshake and ushered me into her office, lined with books and case files. "Do you have all the documents proving ownership?" she asked, flipping through the will I brought. "Yes, both notarized copies and the scanned archive." "Has the other side ever filed a formal challenge?" "Not once. Since my father passed, they've only threatened to sue verbally." She nodded, tapping her pen lightly on the desk. "This case is straightforward. You can send a notice requiring them to vacate within 30 days. If they refuse, we proceed with a lawsuit for unlawful occupancy." I nodded. Nothing in me was rash. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to reclaim what my father had left me. That was never a crime. "But what if they react aggressively?" I asked. Mrs. Davidson studied me, then said slowly, "You need to be prepared. When people live long enough in what doesn't belong to them, they begin to believe it does. And when forced to leave, they'll fight in every way they can, especially if they're used to living without consequence." I left her office with a clearer mind than ever. No more hesitation, no more waiting for anyone to change. My mother had chosen her path. I was simply taking mine. That evening, I drove past the house again. I didn't go in, just stopped across the street. From an upstairs window, a dim light spilled out. Megan's laughter rang down into the quiet night. I didn't hate them. I didn't have enough reason to. But I had no reason to bend anymore either. I pulled out my phone and texted Mrs. Davidson, I agree to proceed. Send the notice for them to vacate. I stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. After 16 years, I was no longer the child listening at doors while others decided my life. I would walk in through the front door, carrying the rightful place my father had given me, and no one, not even my mother, could take that away. The next morning, after the notice was sent, I decided to walk around Maple Lane to steady myself. The early summer air in Seattle carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with lilacs spilling over garden fences, flooding me with memories of the days I once spent with my father. As I turned the third corner, a familiar voice called from behind a white wooden fence. Anna? Is that you? I looked up to see the kind face of Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had lived next to my father's house all those years ago. She looked the same, only with more silver in her hair and a slightly thinner frame. I smiled and walked toward her. Hello, Mrs. Peterson. I didn't expect you'd still be here. She opened the gate and pulled me inside as if afraid I might disappear if she let go. How could I leave when so much next door has been left unsettled? We sat on an old wooden bench under a trellis of bougainvillea. She poured me a cup of chamomile tea, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes still sharp. I saw you outside the house last night, she said quietly, and I saw the way your mother closed the door on you. It broke my heart. I stayed silent, my hands tight around the warm cup. No explanation was needed. Mrs. Peterson understood. A moment later, she rose and went inside. When she returned, she carried a small, worn tin box and set it on the table before me. I've kept this for years, she said, her voice heavy. When your father passed, I helped sort through a few things. One day, someone from the law office came with documents related to the will, but a few supplemental papers weren't added to the official file. He asked me to keep them safe, saying, if one day my girl comes back and needs to understand more, give this to her. I opened the box. Inside was a stack of documents tied with a thin piece of twine. There were old property tax bills, court records confirming ownership after my father's death, and some strange banking notes. I noticed a small folded slip of paper, written in my father's handwriting. Anna, if you are reading this, it means you are strong enough to face the truth. This house is not only the place where you were born, but also where I hid the most important thing I could never let anyone else know except you. My throat tightened. My hands trembled as I turned it over, where my father had sketched the layout of the house. A small symbol was marked in the basement corner, behind the wooden bookshelf. Your father once told me, Mrs. Peterson whispered, that he suspected your mother would never give up the property if given the chance. He had invested in a federal real estate project before he passed. But the documents, ownership certificates, contracts, he kept them hidden, even from the lawyer. Only you were meant to know when the time came. I looked at her, my heartbeat quickening. What kind of project was it? I don't know the details. I only overheard something about a new development south of the city. Maybe by now it's finished, maybe it's profitable. But if you find the files, it could be a huge stepping stone for you. I gripped the stack of papers tightly. The scattered pieces in my mind began connecting. My father's late nights at work, the times he brought me into the basement and locked the door, the way he brushed off questions about savings, all of it suddenly made sense. I thanked Mrs. Peterson, hugging her tightly, as if embracing a fragment of my father still left in the world. On my way home, I called Attorney Davidson and briefly explained what I had just discovered. Do you have a key to the basement? She asked. The basement doesn't have a separate lock, but there's an old bookshelf against the wall, with a cement wall behind it. Then there's a good chance the safe is either in the wall or under the floor. But you'll need an official order to search the house, unless you regain legal access first. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. That night, I spread the documents across my grandparents' living room, carefully sorting through every note my father had left. I printed out the house diagram, marking suspicious spots. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. the next morning, because if what Mrs. Peterson said was true, then the house wasn't just what I wanted back for justice, it could also be the very key to reshaping the future I was building, and I needed to get inside as soon as possible. The day Attorney Davidson sent the official notice demanding my mother's family vacate within 30 days, I thought everything was moving into clear legal territory. But I underestimated their ability to manipulate and distort public opinion. Barely 4 days later, Davidson called me early in the morning with a warning tone. "Anna, you should turn on the local news." I turned on the TV in my grandparents' living room. The morning news was airing a special report about a family property dispute in an old neighborhood in North Seattle. The anchor's voice carried both sympathy and outrage. The mother is accused of occupying a house legally owned by her daughter. However, sources claim the daughter abandoned her mother for years, even while the woman was battling a serious illness. On screen was my mother eyes, red, seated in the living room of my father's house, Richard beside her with a grave look, and Megan holding her pregnant belly. She even shed a few tears, saying, "I never thought my sister could be so cruel, especially now when our family needs stability the most." I froze. The report didn't name me outright, but anyone around Maple Lane knew exactly who they meant. Online comments flooded under the channel's post. "Kids these days are heartless. That daughter is so ungrateful. No one should kick their own sick mother out of a house." My phone buzzed nonstop. Old friends and colleagues from New York texted me, confused and curious. Some relatives on my father's side called, worried about what was happening. I just sat there, heart racing, trapped between fury and helplessness. I called Davidson immediately. She drew in a steady breath before speaking, calm as ever. "Emotional media strategy, Richard is behind this. He has plenty of connections in the real estate association and local press. They're trying to tip public opinion against you." I bit my lip. But it's all lies. My mother was never seriously ill, and she never once asked me for help over the years. "What matters now," she continued, "is keeping this strictly in legal channels. Don't respond online, don't react emotionally. Let me handle the legal fight. As for you, prepare yourself for a long battle." I hung up, staring blankly out the window. My grandmother quietly set a cup of hot tea beside me. My grandfather sat down in the chair across, leaning on his cane, his eyes sharper than usual. "You're not wrong, Anna, but you must be stronger. Liars always know how to wear down the honest." I nodded, my throat tight. The very people who had lived in the house my father left were twisting the truth, weaponizing sympathy and reputation, and worst of all, they believed it was their right. That afternoon, I met with one of my father's old colleagues, Mr. Thompson, who had once worked with him on a federal architecture project. After I explained the situation, he gave a sad smile. "Marcus used to tell me his biggest fear wasn't losing property, it was losing his daughter's memories of that house. He always knew one day you'd come back, but he never thought it would be your own mother standing in your way." Mr. Thompson handed me a small envelope containing old sketches my father had made of the house, including a detailed basement layout. I thanked him, feeling a warmth settle over the cold ache inside me. That night, as the slander spread online, I chose the only thing that kept me from drowning in it all. I wrote a letter by hand, not to send anywhere, just to keep in my desk drawer. "Dear Dad, I'm fighting to reclaim the house you drew with every line of your pencil. They haven't just taken it, they're rewriting the story with lies. But I won't yield. I will walk into that house with everything you left me." I folded the letter and tucked it inside the leather notebook my grandfather had once used. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the scanned investment contract my father had hidden in the safe. In small print was a maturity date this very year, the same year I had returned. I understood then that reclaiming the house wasn't just a legal matter. It was about honor, memory, and the future my father had carefully prepared for me, even in his absence. And I would not let anyone, not even my own blood, erase that. One misty morning, I returned to the house not to confront, but to finish something that had waited over 15 years. Richard and my mother had yet to officially respond to the eviction notice, but Davidson urged me to take advantage of their absence to do what mattered most. I carried the detailed floor plan Mr. Thompson had given me, a small flashlight, gloves, and a few tools. My grandparents didn't want me to go alone, but I insisted this was something between my father and me, something I had to face fully. The front gate was locked, but I still had my father's old key, tucked away in my wallet since college. I wasn't sure it would work, but when I slid it in, the lock gave a dry click, and the door slowly creaked open. The air inside reeked of grease and dampness, far from the faint oak scent I remembered. I walked down the hall, my steps pulling me toward the back room, my father's study, once lined with oak shelves stacked with books, blueprints, and miniature models. Mrs. Peterson had said he guarded that corner bookshelf, never letting anyone touch it. When I laid the floor plan against the wall, the red lines he had drawn matched perfectly with the length of the third shelf from the left. I ran my fingers along the edges until I found a small indentation at the base. I pressed it. A faint click. The heavy shelf shifted about an inch away from the wall, just enough for me to grip and pull. Behind it was another wall, painted dull gray, weathered with age. In its center was a small metal door, a wall safe, unmarked, with only a dial lock and 3 bolts. I placed my hand on the dial, my fingers trembling. I didn't know the code, but one set of numbers echoed in my memory, 061273. My birthday. I turned the dial slowly, took a deep breath, and pulled the handle. A soft snap echoed. The door swung open, and the scent of old paper and metal filled the room, stinging my eyes. Inside were 3 compartments. The first held a notarized copy of the will identical to the one I'd shown Davidson, but with a separate letter clipped to it. I opened the letter, my father's handwriting clear and steady. Anna, if you've found this, it means you've returned with a heart unburdened. I have nothing more precious than our memories in this house, but I didn't stop there. There are things you need to know to protect yourself from what I could not prevent. The second compartment contained a savings account from a local bank. The balance was just over $78,000, not a fortune, but enough to run a small office in the early stages. The last compartment held 3 thick folders, each marked in red ink. On the covers were the words, Kingsbury Development Project, shares 30%, owned by Marcus D. Gray. I froze. Kingsbury wasn't an unfamiliar name. It was a high-end community development taking shape south of Seattle, by Lake Rainier, where every square foot was worth 6 figures. I flipped through the contracts. My father had invested in the earliest seed stage before the project was even officially zoned. He signed under his own name, with a clear clause. The shares could not be transferred until his daughter turned 25. And this year, I was 28, I sank to the floor. In that dusty, cold room, surrounded by forgotten papers, I had just touched something that could completely change my future. It wasn't just financial security. It was my father's silent, unwavering faith that he had always believed in me, always prepared for me, even knowing he wouldn't be here. I pulled out my phone and called Davidson. Her voice, full of surprise, answered, "You found it?" "Yes, both the savings and the shares. The Kingsbury project." She was quiet for a moment, then chuckled softly. Marcus always did see further than most. What should we do now? I asked. We'll submit the supplemental will and the share contracts to the court. At the same time, we'll file a motion to temporarily seal the house, to preserve the asset evidence in case the other side tries anything. From here on, we hold the advantage. I nodded silently. I closed the safe, slid the bookshelf back into place. The room fell quiet, as if no one had ever been there. But I was no longer the girl pushed out of her family's life. I walked out, sunlight hitting my face. Mrs. Peterson stood across the street, arms crossed, squinting at me. When I gave a small nod, she smiled faintly and turned back inside her house. No words were needed. People truly stood with me, not because I was reclaiming a house, but because they knew I was finally walking the right path, and I was ready for whatever came next. I thought I was strong enough to face any storm, especially after finding what my father had hidden. But I didn't expect the very people who once called themselves family to fight back harder than ever, even as the truth stood entirely on my side. Just a few days after my attorney filed the petition in court with the supplemental will and all the share documents, Richard immediately hired a prestigious law firm to fight back. None of them contacted me directly, but what I received by email, handwritten letters, and anonymous messages felt like open threats. We will prove our client has the legal right of possession through special circumstances lasting more than 10 years. You wouldn't want the media to know the truth about your past with your mother, would you? One paper, printed on an old machine with no signature, simply read in bold letters: "Don't let an innocent woman's pregnancy leave her homeless because of your petty revenge." I looked at the paper spread across my grandparents' kitchen table, feeling neither fear nor anger, only as if I were watching a clumsy play. They had run out of arguments, so they resorted to pity and intimidation. Attorney Davidson flipped through the documents, her eyes moving like she was analyzing a case she already knew the ending of. Their strategy is delay. If they can drag this out for a few months, they'll build enough pressure from the media and use Megan's pregnancy as leverage. Legally, their chances are slim. But don't get complacent. The sharpest blows often come from the least expected places. I nodded, though it still stung when I thought of my mother. I had once hoped she might have a moment of clarity, to recognize where family ends and greed begins. But what she did afterward forced me to abandon even that fragile hope. One afternoon, I went by the house with my grandfather to check the structural condition, a step required before the court issued an eviction order. That's when we saw something no one wanted to see. A first-floor window was ajar. Inside, Megan and a man I didn't recognize were carrying out the hand-carved coffee table my father had built himself. It was the only piece he had brought from my grandparents' home in Vermont when I was 5 years old. I didn't cause a scene. Quietly, I pulled out my phone and recorded everything. She had no idea she was being filmed, pointing and instructing the man to remove mirrors, drag chairs, and load them out the back door. Under the porch, I saw boxes of electronics labeled with marker, "Deposit taken." I exhaled slowly, slipped the phone into my pocket, and turned to my grandfather. He said nothing, only squeezed my hand firmly. That evening, I played the video on the large screen for my grandmother. She shook her head, whispering, "Your mother knows about all of this." I stayed silent. Less than 24 hours later, my mother called me for the first time since I had sent the eviction notice. Her voice over the phone was softer, a far cry from the dramatic interviews she'd given on television weeks earlier. She didn't mention the lawsuit or the property. Instead, her tone was half mother, half actress rehearsing lines. "Anna, I know you're angry, but I'm still your mother. You can't throw me and Megan out right now. She's pregnant, her health is fragile. I can't bear to see my grandchild living on the street." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I was wrong, maybe. But you don't have to be so ruthless. You're educated. You have a heart. I waited until she finished, then asked calmly, without raising or trembling my voice. Then how do you explain Megan secretly selling furniture from the house for cash? The silence on the other end was suffocating. She didn't respond. I continued, softer this time. You know exactly what she's doing. You allowed it, maybe even encouraged it. You call it a home, a family nest, but the only thing left in that house is what Dad entrusted not just to me, but to the integrity and dignity he lived by. I didn't, she faltered. I just wanted Megan to have something to hold on to. I don't owe Megan, and I don't owe you. I paused, then spoke each word as if carving it from the ache inside me. I once wanted nothing more than to be held by you, even just once. But you chose someone else. You gave my room to another girl. You called me a burden. Now you choose to pretend remorse, to cling to a house that was never yours. A faint sob came through the receiver, but I felt nothing except a deep, exhausted weariness. The court will decide, I said quietly. I won't compromise anymore. I hung up and let out a long breath. On the table, the video replayed the creak of the door each time another item was dragged out. Though I hated to admit it, a wound remained inside me, not for the material loss, but for the mother who had once filled every drawing I made as a child. Now, those drawings had faded, and there was only one path left, to go all the way in protecting what remained of my father's memory. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at the King County Superior Court, a place known for handling the toughest property disputes in the region. I arrived early, sitting alone outside the courtroom, clutching the leather bag that held every crucial document I'd gathered over the past 3 months. Attorney Davidson arrived on the dot. She wore a gray suit, simple, decisive, with a case file under her arm. She placed a hand on my shoulder, saying gently, "You don't need to force strength. Let the truth do its work." I nodded. I wasn't stronger than anyone else, but I refused to take another step back. When we entered the courtroom, I saw my mother seated across the aisle. Her hair was pinned high, her dress dark, her eyes fixed forward without meeting mine. Richard sat beside her, arms folded, looking smug, as if he were in a board meeting instead of facing the law. Their attorney, a man named Howard in his 50s, with a deep voice and sharp eyes, began with an aggressive opening, painting me as an arrogant young woman, naive and incapable of managing valuable property. "Your Honor, Miss Anna Gray," he stressed my name, "has lived away from this house for nearly 16 years. She has no real estate experience, no residence there, and virtually no connection with her family. We believe my client, Mrs. Lorraine Simmons, has raised, preserved, and maintained this house all these years. To coldly reclaim it now is not only inhumane but also lacking moral grounds." I sat still, unblinking, letting him speak. I didn't need to interrupt. Davidson rose, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, this house is not a gift to be decided by sentiment. It is a protected inheritance, safeguarded by law, by a notarized will, by the dying words of a father to his only daughter." She presented the will, stamped in red by the state notary office, explicitly naming me as the owner since my father's passing, unbroken, uncontested until now. We also have evidence that Mr. Richard Simmons, who is living illegally in this property, was investigated for financial fraud in 2011, she continued. Records from the State Financial Regulatory Office confirm he created 2 shell companies to evade taxes and transfer assets, leading to the suspension of his business license for 5 years. A wave of murmurs rippled through the conference courtroom. Richard's face paled, though he tried to remain composed. Davidson wasn't finished. She placed another file on the bench. "Additionally, local police have verified threatening messages sent by Mr. Simmons to Miss Anna Gray." These include recorded calls and text transcripts clearly showing violent intent. The judge, a stern but fair woman of advanced age, called for order as she reviewed each document. Then she looked from me to my mother. "Mrs. Lorraine Simmons, do you wish to add anything before we deliver a ruling?" My mother stood. I had never seen her shake so much. She glanced around, then turned slowly toward me. Anna is my daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong to let her live away from me for so long. But she doesn't understand. All these years, I held on to that house not for myself, but because I thought I was protecting my husband's memory. I know I don't have the right, but—" She turned away, wiping her tears. I watched her, not with blame, but without softening either. No late tears could erase years of neglect and denial. The judge gave a slight nod. "Thank you for your honesty." After a few minutes of private discussion with the panel, she rose, gavel in hand. "After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and related documents, the court hereby rules the ownership of the house on Maple Lane belongs solely to Miss Anna Gray. The family of Mr. Richard Simmons has no legal right to reside in or use this property from this moment forward. The court also grants the request for a restraining order of 6 months against Mr. Simmons and Miss Megan Simmons. Any attempt to approach, threaten, or endanger the safety of the plaintiff will be treated as a criminal offense." The gavel struck, echoing through the silent courtroom. I didn't look at my mother, nor did I glance back. I simply clenched my hands, steadied my breath, and stood up, walking out with my attorney out of that room where I had not only reclaimed a house, but also my faith in fairness and justice. Outside, the sky was still gray, yet I felt lighter than any morning in years. Not because of victory, but because I had stood tall in the face of distortion and refused to let myself become part of it. I returned to the house one late afternoon in mid-April, exactly a week after the final ruling. The sun was dipping behind the western hills, its amber light spilling over the stone steps, illuminating cracks in the railing, peeling paint on the walls, and dusty windows. The house looked like it had weathered years of storms, worn down, silent, but still standing. Richard and Megan had left on the 3rd day after receiving the eviction order. My mother was the last to leave. She said nothing, left no note. Only a set of keys sealed in a white envelope, tucked beneath the door. I opened each door, flipped each switch. The living room light flickered, then steadied. The kitchen smelled of mildew and old grease. My father's bedroom was empty, yet the curtain he had once chosen still hung there, faded by time. I drew a deep breath. The next morning, I hired a professional cleaning crew. Electricians, plumbers, and an interior architect. The house needed more than a cleaning, it needed to be revived. For 6 weeks, I was almost always at the site. I kept my father's original wooden frame intact, repainted the walls while preserving the muted tones. The living room was expanded, following the sketch my father had once drawn in his notebook, a sketch I had discovered along with the investment documents. The ground floor was redesigned into an office, with oak flooring and glass doors opening to the garden. I didn't plan to live here permanently, but I wanted this place to have a soul, just as my father once said. A house is only truly a home when those who live in it live with honesty. When the renovation neared completion, I received a call from the Kingsbury Development Corporation. The representative's tone was formal, yet tinged with excitement. "Miss Gray, I'm calling to update you. Your shares in the project have been revalued after negotiations with an Asian investor group. The final figure is $2,360,000. We'll transfer the funds after the tax and authorization paperwork is finalized." I was silent for a long moment. On the other end, he thought the line had dropped. "Miss Gray, are you still there?" "I hear you. I said, my voice rough. Thank you. And thank my father. I looked out at the back garden, where he had once planted wooden stakes to teach me directions, where he had shown me how to plant radishes in straight rows. I didn't know if he had ever envisioned such numbers when he invested, but I believed he had envisioned his daughter having a foundation strong enough to stand no matter what. The very next day, I signed a deposit contract with a tech design company, the first partner for the startup I had been building in my mind for 6 years. The house would become the company's headquarters. No flashy signs, no loud advertisements, just an old house with glass doors facing the garden where we would sit together, creating in peace. 3 days later, my mother came. I had just stepped out into the backyard when I saw her standing on the porch, her figure smaller in an old coat, hair loosely pinned, clutching her handbag. She hadn't knocked. She hadn't called ahead. I froze for a moment, then walked closer, keeping just enough distance. I want to talk, she said, her voice raspier than I remembered. I didn't answer. She stepped forward, lifting her eyes to mine. I didn't come to reclaim anything. I just want you to know I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted a home, a place to belong. I studied her face. The coldness I had seen in court was gone, as was the calculation of the weeks before. What remained was only a woman who had lost something she could never recover. I spoke slowly, each word placed like a stone. You already had a home. You chose it years ago, when you let me walk away without holding on. She opened her mouth to reply, but I shook my head. And this is not your home, and no longer a place you can return to. I walked back inside, the wooden door closing softly behind me. I didn't lock it, didn't slam it. I simply let it rest like I had learned to do after peeling away layers of dust in this house. On the day I signed the official contract, the sun shone gently, the breeze lifting the curtains I had chosen to match my father's taste. The design team arrived early. Engineers set up the 3D models, and I signed each page with a strange calm. On the contract, the address was printed in bold. 417 Maple Lane. No more disputes, no more denial. Only me, and the dream of beginning again, not out of anger, but with dignity and faith in things built with true love. The house had a new soul, and so did I. I stood by the window of my new office, once my father's old bedroom. The late light spilled across the oak desk, and I suddenly remembered the way he used to sit here, head bent over his drawings, each line steady and strong, like him. This journey wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about restoring my own worth through wounds, denial, and finally, the choice to forgive without holding on. I don't know what others would do in my place, but I know this. True freedom doesn't come from clinging to what you keep, but from daring to release what once made you weak. And what about you? If faced with a family that once denied you, used tears to hide greed, claimed kinship to take what wasn't theirs, would you have the courage to draw the line and move forward? I would love to hear your answer. Share your thoughts in the comments. I believe each of us carries a story, sometimes quiet, sometimes fierce, but always worth sharing. If you're interested in real stories about family, about loss, and about the fight to reclaim fairness, don't forget to be Time Days. Follow this channel. There are many more stories I want to tell, not just mine, but those of people learning to stand, to love themselves again, from the very ruins. Thank you for listening today. And if you've ever walked through the door of pain to find light again, then I believe you're on the right path. Just as I am, just as my father always hoped.